Good day everyone, I am John Edward C. Caldeo, together with Mary Rose C. Caldeo, and we're going to discuss The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. Background of the literary piece. The Story of an Hour is a phenomenal American short story written by Kate Chopin on April 19, 1894, and published in Vogue on December 2, 1894. Initially, it was written and first published under the title The Dream of an Hour. It was reprinted in St. Louis Life on January 5, 1895. The title of the short story refers to the time elapsed between the moments at which the protagonist, Louise Mallard, hears that her husband is dead and discovers that he is alive after all. The Story of an Hour was considered controversial during the 1898s because it deals with a female protagonist who feels liberated by the news of her husband's death. In unveiling Kate Chopin, Emile Thoth argues that Chopin had to have her heroine die in order to make the story publishable. Significance of literary piece. The Story of an Hour has been strongly linked with the ideals of the women's liberation movement of the 1960s when feminists took a stand to fight to give women more freedom in America. The reason The Story of an Hour was a significant piece of literary work at this time was because of its radical story. In the story, this housewife who has been confined to the social norms of the obedient wife has an unorthodox reaction to the death of her husband. She anticipates her newfound freedom from the suppression of the husband of men and becomes invigorated by it. Thus, the literary piece shows a woman's break from the norms of society. Background of the author. Kate Chopin, 1850 to 1904, is an American writer best known for her stories about the inner lives of sensitive, daring women. Her novel The Awakening and her short stories are read today in countries around the world, and she is widely recognized as one of America's essential authors. Her short stories were well received in the 1890s and were published by some of America's most prestigious magazines: Vogue, The Atlantic Monthly, Harper's Young People, The Youth's Companion, and The Century. Many of her stories also appeared in her two published collections, Bayou Folk 1894 and A Night in Acadie 1897. Both of which received good reviews from critics across the country who praised them for their graceful descriptions of the lives of Creoles, Acadians, African Americans, and other people in Louisiana. 26 of her stories are children's stories, those published in or intended for children's or family magazines, The Youth's Companion, and others. By the late 1890s, Kate Chopin was well known among American readers of magazine fiction. Her early novel At Fault 1890 was not much noticed, but The Awakening 1899 was widely condemned. Critics called it morbid, vulgar, and disagreeable. Chopin's work was mostly forgotten after her death, but beginning in the 1950s, scholars rediscovered it and praised it for its truthful depictions of women's lives.
Before we proceed to discussion, let's watch first the short clip of The Story of an Hour.
This program is rated PG. It contains themes and scenes which may not be suitable for very young audiences. Parental guidance is advised.
Knowing that Mrs. Mallard was afflicted with a heart trouble, great care was taken to break to her as gently as possible the news of her husband's death. It was her sister Josephine who summoned her. Her husband's friend Richard was there too. It was he who had been in the newspaper office when news of the railroad disaster was received. She did not hear the story as many women have heard the same, with a paralyzed inability to accept its significance. She wept at once, with sudden, wild abandon. When the storm of grief had spent itself, she went away to her room alone. She would have no one follow her.
Free. 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 Free, body and soul. Free. Free. Free.
What are you doing, Louise? You'll make yourself ill. For heaven's sake, open the door.
I am not making myself ill. No, I am drinking the very elixir of life from that open window. My fancy is running wild with the days ahead of me. Spring days, summer days, days that will be my own.
Surely you must feel some grief.
I know that I shall weep again. When I see Brentley's kind, tender hands folded in death, his face fixed, gray and dead. But I see beyond that bitter moment, a long procession of years to come that will belong to me, absolutely. There will be no one to live for me. I will live for myself. No powerful will bending mine in blind persistence.
It was out of the kindness of his own heart.
A kind intention or a cruel intention makes the act seem no less a crime.
Mrs. Mallard did not stop to ponder if it were or were not a monstrous joy that held her.
I had loved him sometimes, sometimes not. But what could love, the unsolved mystery, count for in the face of
Brentley Mallard had been far from the scene of the railroad accident, and did not even know there had been one. When the doctor came, he said she had died of heart disease, of joy that kills.
For the discussion, I made a graphic organizer so that you could easily understand the flow of the story. We have here the author, characters, setting, plot, major events of the story, and the theme. The first one is the author. So the author of the story of an hour is Chopin, and she is an American author. Her work was greatly criticized in her time period, and she stood up for women's rights, and The Story of an Hour was one of her most significant short stories, and it was published on December in the year 1894. Second, characters. So there are 4 characters in the story, namely Bentley Mullard. He is the husband of Louise that supposedly killed in a train accident. Although Louise remembers Bentley as a kind and loving man, merely being married to him also made him an oppressive factor in her life. And Bentley arrives home unaware that there had been a train accident. Next, Mrs. Louise Mullard. She is the story's protagonist, a woman with a heart condition who has just gotten news of her husband's death in a railroad disaster. Then, Josephine. So she is the sister of Mrs. Mullard, and she is the one who informs Louise about Bentley's death. And lastly, Richards. He is Bentley's friend who was in the railroad office when the telegram arrived with Mullard's name on the list of killed. The next one is the setting. So the setting of this story was happened at Mullard's residence. So Chopin does not offer many clues as to where or when the action of the story take place other than in Mullard's house. So this general setting supports the theme of community accepted views of the appropriate roles for women in the society. The fourth one is the plot. So in the story of an hour, the exposition here is when Mrs. Mullard is sick and suffers from a weak heart. Her sister Josephine comforts her, concerned that the news she is about to hear will kill her heart. In Rising Action, it is when Josephine and Richards, a friend of Mr. Bentley Mullard, gently reveal that Mr. Mullard has been killed in a railroad disaster. In Climax, Mrs. Mullard, though grieving, realizes that she is now free from a marriage in which she wasn't truly happy. So though she mourns the death of her husband, she secretly elated. In Falling Action, after Mrs. Mullard comes to the conclusion that she is now free to live a happy life, she and Josephine walk down just as Mr. Mullard, unharmed by the tragic accident, comes through the door. Lastly, in Resolution, Mrs. Mullard collapses and dead. So the doctor said that she had died from heart disease of joy that kills. He thought she was overjoyed to see him and she died. In reality, she realized her freedom was never to be, and that killed her. The fifth one, major events of the story. So in the literary piece, The Story of an Hour, the major events that we found out is that after knowing that her husband, Bentley Mullard, had died in a train crash, Mrs. Mullard was overcome with grief. Second one, when Mrs. Mullard went to her room alone, her grief transforms into joy as she realizes that Bentley Mullard's death will free her from her repressive marriage. And the third one, An overjoyed Mrs. Mullard exits to her room upon seeing her husband returning home, having been nowhere near the accident. She dies from a heart attack. The last but not least, the theme. So in the literary piece, we can say that these are the themes of the story of an hour. The first one, oppressiveness of marriage. Who we marry is one of the most important decisions in life. So Mrs. Mullard, who readily admits that her husband was kinda loving, nonetheless feels joy when she believes that he has died. Her reaction doesn't suggest any malice, and Louise knows that she'll cry at Bentley's funeral. However, despite the love between husband and wife, Louise views Bentley's death as a release from the oppression. She never names a specific way in which Bentley oppressed her, hinting instead that marriage in general stifles both women and men. She even seems to suggest that she oppressed Bentley just as much as he oppressed her. Louis' epiphany, in which these thoughts parade through her mind, reveals the inherent oppressiveness of all marriages, which by their nature rob people of their independence. The next one, freedom and independence. There is a hidden joy of independence. The story focuses on the inner desires for freedom. Mrs. Mullard's desire for freedom far exceeds her love for him that goes against the norms of society. So Mrs. Mullard is overjoyed by the realization that Mrs. Mullard's death will render her free to live as she chooses, highlighting the repressive nature of Victorian marriages. The third one, the time. In such a short period, so much can happen. Time is a matter of perception, and Louise' hour of imagined freedom comes at the cost of her life. The last one, identity. So an individual discovers their self-identity only after being freed from confinement. So Louise has long been denied a sense of selfhood due to her role as a wife. Bentley's death offers her the chance to explore and claim her own identity. So basically, she has no real identity of her own. When she finds out Bentley has died, the promise of becoming her own person and gaining her own identity fills her with joy. And again, that would be all, and thank you for listening. And this is Mary Rose Caldea together with my partner, John Radford, signing off.